Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Sandel's great book on justice, and we'll be discussing chapter 5 on Immanuel Kant, one of the great theorists, one of the great thinkers of history. So let us begin. Kant is a proponent of individual rights, and as we've seen before, a main objection to utilitarianism, to the view that what is right is what maximizes happiness, what brings about the greatest pleasure for everyone involved. The greatest objection to that is that it's hard for that view to accommodate individual rights. And multiple thinkers have tried to put forth individual rights as a way of constraining the purely utilitarian way of thinking about morality. Libertarians, we saw, do that. They think that there are individual rights. But for people that argue for individual rights, we must ask, what are those things? What are individual rights? And what are they based on? What are they grounded in? In virtue of what do things or beings or persons have individual rights? And libertarians have an answer to this, have a story to tell. And they begin with the basic claim that everyone owns themselves. So it's a basic property right that one holds with regards to one's body. And then from that, extensions of the body, like through work and things like that, can be built. As we've seen, some very problematic consequences follow from taking this line of thought very seriously. So there are objections, serious objections to foregoing with the libertarian way of thinking. Another main proponent of individual rights is John Locke. And he grounds morality in general and individual rights in particular on God. He thinks that we human beings have individual rights because we're made by God in that way. God bestows upon human beings individual rights. And that might be a perfectly sound view. However, it's hard to defend in a pluralistic society in which not everyone believes in God. It brings in some, at the very least, dialectic limitations to ground rights on God in the context of pluralistic society. Kant has a different view. And his view, Kant's view, which is pretty widespread after he articulated it this particular way, is that individual rights are based on the fact that humans are rational agents. It is humans' rational capacity that grounds our ability to act freely and responsibly, and thereby grants us also our dignity in our individual rights, which are based on that. So it is our capacities to reason, to understand, especially moral truth, to understand what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, and then to be able to freely choose on the basis of our comprehension of reality, especially moral reality. It is those capacities to reason and act freely, which is grounded in reason, and those are the capacities that ground individual rights. That's why beings that have those rational capacities should be treated with dignity. That's the ground of the dignity. It's worth pointing out that this is perfectly compatible with, say, Locke's view. Locke can very well say that God bestowed individual rights upon humans by making them rational, right? But one of the beauties of Kant's view is that it doesn't go through God. And so people that disagree with God or the particular conception of God, they're not put off by this account. And people that believe in God don't have to be put off by this, right? So you can be a theist and still endorse what Kant says. In fact, a lot of theists have. So that's a dialectical strength in Kant's view. So freedom grounds moral dignity. But what is this thing, freedom? This thing that a lot of people like to champion. You might think the following. Freedom is the ability to do what you want. One is free to the extent that one can act on the basis of what they want to do. A lot of people say things like this, but Kant claims that this is false. It is false to think of freedom in this way. Freedom is different. For us to get started here, a couple of claims about freedom. Many things, many factors can diminish or altogether remove our freedom. For example, coercion. When there's a force external to the agent that is making the agent do something. So, for example, if someone puts a gun to my head and say, "Hey, give me $100," I will give them $100 because I don't want to die. But that's not really free in any robust sense of the word freedom, right? I'm being coerced through a very serious threat to my life to hand over the $100. If that person were to later say, "Hey, you freely give me $100," they would be clearly lying. Something else is happening here. There's a force external to my agency that is the main explanation for my actions. It's not my agency, my freedom, my will that is choosing that. Something is imposed upon me, and I still have the option of saying no and dying. But that's a very thin kind of freedom. That really is more like coercion. And to the extent that an action is coerced, to that extent that it's less free. That's a clear claim. That's a clear point about freedom. And ignorance as well. If I make choices on the basis of without knowledge, it seems that my freedom is diminished as well. If I think I'm doing something, so if I go on a trip to this country that I have heard some great things about, and when I buy the tickets, when I make the plans and so on, I think I'm going to this great country that has all these wonderful attractions. But unbeknownst to me, it turns out those attractions are closed, that some serious illness is going around, that it's closing everything, or something like that, or something that I do not know has radically changed the kind of experience that I think I will have when I go to that country. There's also a deep sense in which I'm not really being free to go there. The ignorance that I have, my lack of knowledge about crucial facts about the thing that I take myself to be doing going to this trip, that ignorance diminishes my freedom. I am less free in my choosing something if that choice is grounded in ignorance or error. In social pressure as well. So that's not a third factor. If I do what I do, not because I'm really choosing to do so, but because there's this intense social pressure for me to do so, to the extent that I'm merely succumbing to those social pressures, I fail to assert my identity, I fail to assert myself, I fail to exercise my agency and freedom. I'm merely being pushed around by factors, and that I'm in some sense external to me, social factors, social pressure. So it's clear that there are different kinds of factors that lead to my behavior, to people's behavior, but they're not really the expression of freedom. They are things other than freedom that ultimately result in my actions. Social pressure, ignorance, and coercion are uncontestable examples for that. So Kant, of course, like virtually all theorists think, yeah, these things get in the way of the freedom. But Kant thinks, here's something else that gets in the way of freedom. Here's something else that settles my action that is not really me, that is not really my agency. It's something else that diminishes my freedom. You might be surprised to hear this, that's desire. So Kant thinks that desire diminishes our freedom. If we do something, if we act, because we're succumbing to, we're giving into a very strong desire, like Kant thinks that action we're not really free. It looks more like someone putting a gun to my head and then me succumbing to it, me giving into the threat. Except that the thing that is the factor that is settling my action happens to be within my body, but that is an accidental factor. That does not matter for freedom, says Kant. If the threat or the pressure is outside, like coercion or social pressure, or inside, like a very strong desire, it's still coercing me. It's still settling my action in the wrong way. It's still undermining my freedom. Desire acting in this way is not an expression of freedom. So freedom is not the ability to do what we want when the expression we want is to be read as a desire. For Kant, that is a limitation of freedom, not an expression of freedom, something that undermines freedom. So what is freedom? Well, here's the basic account, the Kantian account. To be free is to act autonomously, to act in such a way that oneself is the source of the action, not some external threat, a guy with a gun, not some mistake, some ignorance, not some social pressure, or even not an intense desire that is separate from my ability to reason and think, and choose on the basis of how I reason and think. My act is free to the extent that my agency, myself, is the source and the explanation for my actions. So Kant calls that autonomy. To act autonomously is to give ourselves the law that explains one's actions, one's reasons for actions. I am the source of my actions, not others. And when that is the case, I am free. And not things like desire as well. So it is only through acts of will, which are not the same, which are not to be confused with mere desires, but acts of will, choices, decisions. They're things that follow reason. They are things we do in light of deliberation and understanding of reasons. Those choices, that's how we act autonomously, through choices. not the other pressures that settle my actions. So to describe this, to tease this out a little bit more, Kant makes a distinction, important distinction between acting from inclination and acting from duty. And here's the basic distinction. Acting from inclination is acting from the passions or from desires, and therefore not acting freely, because it's the desires, the passions that are settling the action, not my agency, not my reason, not my true self. So to act from inclination is to act from instinct or from emotion or from desire. To act from inclination is to act unreflectively, that is without thinking, non-deliberatively, simply because you feel like it. It's responding. It's a stimulus response kind of mechanism. It's a lower animals kind of instinctive way of responding. You feel something in the moment and you just act without thinking. Like this picture, for example, I mean, it's not quite correct, but assume that this picture is depicting a woman being very angry and punching a guy because she's very angry. It's not quite what's happening. But if a woman gets very angry with a guy and without thinking, she just punches him, like let us suppose that's what's happening here, Kant will say, if to the extent that it is anger that is explaining her action, that is the motivation for her action, to that extent, she's acting from inclination, from passion, from desire, and not from reason, not from thinking, not from deliberating, not from reflecting upon what she should be doing. And she's acting like a lower animal, like that's how lower animals do. They just stimulation response mechanisms. To the extent that she's doing that, to that extent, she's not free. She's just responding. Lower animals do that. Lower animals are not free. So the contrast is to act from duty. To act from duty is to act on the basis of deliberate judgment and reason. It is, let us change the picture a little bit. Let's suppose that they're boxing. And let us suppose that she's thinking about strategies for winning the boxing match. And she realizes that when he throws a left hook, he lets his face expose in some particular way. And she deliberately, consciously acts in a strategy that identifies the weakness of the other fighter and punches him because of that. She's thinking about the strategy for when to punch, how to punch. And the explanation, the motivation for her punching is to win this kind of game, the boxing game, on the basis of deliberation, reflection, and thinking. She's acting on strategy. The reason is guiding her actions. If that's what's happening here, she's much more free than she is when she acts from anger, Kant thinks. She's more in control of her actions. She's master of her own actions in a way in which she just responds when she responds without thinking. She's not. She's being pushed by the passions. She's being the slave of the forces around her, not the agent, not the one who's guiding, not the source of the actions. When she's deliberating, she's the source. Furthermore, to act from duty is to act because the act is the right one. So that's the right thing to do. When one chooses to do something, for it to be a choice, it has to be the kind of act that follows the judgment of reason. And the motivation is the judgment of reason. It's not the mere desire. So to act from duty is to choose to act. And to act from passions is to act in a way that you're not choosing, you're not reasoning, you're just responding, stimulus response. For Kant, one is an agent and is morally responsible and is expressing one's freedom only in the cases in which it is reason and deliberation that are guiding one's actions. If it is desire, if it's coercion, if it's ignorance, if it's some external force, all of those undermine your agency, undermine your freedom, undermine your status as a moral agent who's responsible for their actions. You're not really being free. Something else is happening. You're being pushed around by some factors that are not of your own making. You do not give the law to yourself that explains your actions. And it is by giving the law to yourself that explains your actions that you're free. That's an expression of freedom. Okay, let's end here. We'll continue talking about Kant next time. See ya.